Log on to patreon.com/Dane Calloway or paypal.me/Dane Calloway to support me, my channel, and my content. By demand, merchandise is now available at I'mJustHereToMakeYouThink.com. Okay, everyone. Now today I want to share some detailed paramount information concerning this topic at hand that many of you might not be aware of. But before I begin this segment, I would like to state a few indispensable quotes. And they are, a race of people is like an individual man until it uses its own talent, takes pride in its own history, expresses its own culture, affirms its own selfhood, it can never fulfill itself. Malcolm X. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us. Also, Malcolm X. A brief synopsis of these quotes entails that there is an uncommonly known factual description about racism. That alternative description would be best described as one's pride for one's own race. But that same pride is not limited to just love or respect for one's race, nor hate or discrimination when interacting with other races of people. It's deeper than that. See, when an individual's true heritage, identity, history, and culture is literally taken away from them during the times of forcefully establishing yet another race of people's uprising, that individual's race suffers tremendously from generations of historic and modified oppression, partisanship, and manipulation systematically. Now, in today's society of America, the offsprings of the indigenous Niji of Turtle Island are yet still undergoing the effects of these things that I just mentioned. When will this all stop, you ask? Well, once the indigenous Americans becomes cognizant of the differences between truths and facts, then and only then will the actual dialogue begin environmentally. See, for you as a person of color in America, there are two definitions of environmental racism. The not so verbally popular factor will be that racism is your environment. Racism is all around you. The other factor is a form of racial discrimination in the development and implementation of environmental policy, especially as manifested in the concentration of hazardous waste disposal sites in or near areas with a relatively large ethnic minority population. These sites, or rather known as facilities, release a heavy toxic stew of pollutants, including formaldehyde, which has been linked to causing cancer, and benzene, which has been tracked to being one of the causes of brain damage, cancer, and birth defects still to this day. Now, according to multiple sources and many studies, this environmental racism is directly affecting more than 5 million indigenous aboriginals right here in North America at this time, and this number is more than likely set to drastically increase soon after I release this video. The NAACP has raised many concerns about this matter ever since the 1980s. Their most recent report entails that people of color are, quote, 75% more likely to live in so-called fence-line communities that are next to industrial facilities. The people of color who predominantly resides in these so-called fence-line communities are considered to be low-income residents, in which they are heavily targeted by environmental racism, with well over 1 million or so living just a half a mile from gas and oil facilities, leaving them facing some very serious health risks like cancer, asthma, and other respiratory diseases, just to name a few. Now, does the government have any idea that this is going on, with being one of the main causes of millions of people of color's deaths? Let's go some decades back in time to see where the real answer to this question resides. On September 27, 1962, author Rachel Louise Carson published a non-fictional environmental science book entitled Silent Spring that managed to immediately catch the attention of the entire nation due to what she detailed inside of the book. Carson's arresting book was carefully well-researched and unconventionally presented to the public. She mainly targeted the indiscriminate use of pesticides, which wound up causing an uproar and public debatable opinions. Carson's overall devotion derived from her fear that fewer species of birds will be singing each spring unless pesticide poisoning was retrenched. Readers of her book immediately caught the hidden message that Carson was blatantly exposing. Even though she was a bird lover, the book just wasn't only pertaining to birds being poisoned, but any number of humans dying from any number of hidden poisons lurking throughout the environment. Carson's research and other relatable works forced fears in and grieving anger from particular chemical companies and their affiliated organizations that campaigned to ban the release of her book, Silent Spring, nationwide. Many politicians were involved with quelling her speech and discrediting her character and research as she fought in the courts to get this information out. For example, the former U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Ezra Taft Benson, wrote in a letter to the president at that time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, that because Carson was unmarried despite being physically attractive, she was, quote, probably a communist. Coincidentally, Carson mysteriously died just 2 years after her book was finally released. Now, she was previously battling breast cancer, but she died from complications of an undisclosed respiratory virus in 1964 at the age of just 56. Between the years of 1962 and 1970, millions of people drew their opinions and concerns about these ongoing chemical companies and their poisonous pollutants threatening humanity in North America. No real documented action was taken until the year of 1969, when then-President Richard Nixon abided to eliminate the most threatening causes of death through water and airborne pollution. At a time when Nixon and his administration was preoccupied with the recession-ridden economy, along with the not-so-public-friendly war, Nixon established what was called a cabinet-level Environmental Quality Council, along with the Citizens Advisory Committee on Environmental Quality during the month of May in 1969. These councils or commissions that Nixon established did not sit well with millions of U.S. citizens, nor the national media for that matter. So Nixon moved on to position a consideration of a separate environmental federal agency in December of 1969. Very shortly after that, Congress sent Nixon a bill known as the NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. Listen closely. According to Congress, the NEPA of 1970 is said to be a U.S. environmental law that promotes the enhancement of the environment. The NEPA law states that its purposes is to, quote, declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment. 2, to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere and stimulate the health and welfare of man. And 3, to enrich our understanding of ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation. But what is very important to note here, according to unclassified documents that I requested by way of the Freedom of Information Act, the NEPA of 1969 was created to, quote, ensure federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of their actions and decisions. One more time. The NEPA of 1969 was created to ensure federal agencies consider the environmental impacts of their actions and decisions. So you mean to tell me that not only does this NEPA Act blatantly exposes the fact that the U.S. federal government is responsible for poisoning our environment in America, but this NEPA Act is more like an open letter to ask for the mercy of these federal agencies to please consider their actions and decisions when they feel like impacting our environment? Also, keep in mind that this bill was signed and immediately passed into law on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1970, by President Richard Nixon. On January 22nd, 1970, Nixon gave his State of the Union address, speaking to both houses of Congress, stating that the, quote, 1970s, a historic period when, by a conscious choice, we transformed our land into what we wanted to become. Nixon continued this activist theme on February 10th, 1970, when he announced the 37 Environmental Action Program, listen to this, that gives special emphasis to strengthening these federalized programs when dealing with water and air pollution. 2 months after that, the celebration of Earth Day was born, April 22nd, 1970, when an estimated 20 million people showed up in support of this newly established environmental reform, allegedly. According to documented reports on this day, by way of the LOC, oil-coated ducks were dumped on the doorstep of the Department of the Interior. European-American students disguised as the Grim Reaper stalked a General Electric Company stockholders meeting, while other European-American protesters dragged a net filled with dead fish down Fifth Avenue and shouted to passerbys the phrase, "This could be you." So these reports proves that not everybody was in agreement with this environmental reform. The EPA, also known as the Environmental Protection Agency, was established on December 2nd, 1970 by then U.S. President Richard Nixon. Now, according to the United States government, the EPA is a federal agency of the United States federal government whose mission is to protect human and environmental health. So Nixon, along with his administration and other federal agencies, consolidated a variety of federal research, monitoring, standard setting, and enforcement activities into one federal agency in order to allegedly ensure environmental protection, or what the EPA is responsible for coining as environmental equity. But wait a minute. When you hear the word equity, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Money, value, rights, ownership. But we all know that equity can mean fairness as well, so let's see which definition they are using by the depictions of their direct actions. From the early 1970s to the mid-1990s, nearly all communities where people of color resided struggled with standing against the forced placement of toxic waste plants and other polluting facilities close to their neighborhoods. For example, in a 1982 Washington Post article, the term environmental racism was used when so-called African American protesters captured the national media attention by launching mass demonstrations against the proposed construction of a landfill for highly toxic chemicals known as PCBs in Warren County, North Carolina. Walter Fauntroy, who was the District of Columbia delegate to Congress in 1982, commissioned a U.S. General Accounting Office study which revealed that 3 of the 4 commercial hazardous waste facilities in EPA Region 4, which includes North Carolina, were all in areas that are occupied by people of color, while the 4th was in a low-income area that was predominantly occupied by people of color as well. Did the EPA do anything about this after it was brought to their attention nationally? No. So in 1983, Robert Bullard, a researcher and a pioneer in the environmental justice movement, concluded that he found in his research hard evidence that 21 of Houston, Texas' 25 solid waste facilities were located in neighborhoods where only people of color resided. So, did the EPA or the government do anything this time around? Not one bit. Thousands of similar reports were manifesting through the 1980s and 1990s from South Carolina, Texas, Louisiana, North Carolina, California, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and the list goes on and on and on. During the early part of the year of 1994, many indigenous community leaders pressured then President Bill Clinton to sign an executive order on the term environmental injustice, which required all federal agencies to, quote, make achieving environmental justice part of its mission by addressing, as appropriate, disproportionately high adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations. Now, even though this 1994 executive order was federally mandated and a few individual states promised to correct these life-threatening issues, the U.S. government, state governments, and the U.S. federal government all failed to perform their duties as delegated within this legislative motion. In fact, excluding the areas where European Americans resided that allowed for chemical facilities demolishment and rehabilitation and reconstruction of their communities as safe zones, the majority of the areas that were affected by this environmental racism are in fact still in that very same position today. This all goes back to what I stated earlier. For the people of color in America, racism is your environment because it is literally all around you. And since this form of discrimination works only against one race of people in this sense, and with both governments in full control of this entire poisonous operation, environmental racism is merely just a modified version of Jim Crow. I'm just here to make you think.